Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local.
And that brings me to my item, which is sort of DuckDuckGo this week, I think. It may have been last week, actually.
June 16th. It's a little bit ago, but it just surfaced in my feed. So.
Yeah, and I was not aware of it either. But DuckDuckGo reported that over the last year, they've seen 50 million app downloads and a 55% increase in search traffic. And they now claim to be the number 2 search engine on mobile devices in US, Canada, Australia, Netherlands, and other markets, which puts them ahead, obviously, of Bing, Yahoo. I don't know who else is left. But it's an interesting moment in search because, there was a time years ago when there was a lot of intense competition in search, and then that ended and Google sort of developed its dominant position. And now, we're seeing some activity. There's Neva, which is a subscription-based search engine that hasn't fully launched yet. And then Brave just made an announcement where they're adding a search engine to their browser for sort of a holistic package, and DuckDuckGo, obviously, which I just mentioned. So are we in a moment where there is going to be a bit more competitive pressure on Google in search, or do you think that this is just sort of a momentary blip and, or not going to impact Google at all?
I think part of the question for me is what's Apple doing? And what Apple is doing is making search a feature of the app of their phone. And in doing that, if they are forced to separate from Google in this $9 billion a year deal they have through some of these antitrust things, then I think you'll see a shifting. But right now they are trying to disintermediate Google by turning Google into just one line amongst several in a typical phone search where you can search from any place. And to me, that's the big player here, not DuckDuckGo. Not that DuckDuckGo doesn't have a niche opportunity, which Brave has as well, that I think will play well in a privacy world. But both of them run the risk of being overrun by one of these larger, more funded, more broad platforms.
And I would say,
go ahead.
I would say it's more likely that it's the combination of factors that, I don't think DuckDuckGo is a Google killer by any stretch, or Brave or any of these other guys. But I do think, you could see an erosion of market share from near 100% now to something closer to, say, 75 over the next 4 or 5 years. I could certainly see that. And then we also don't know what's going to happen with the regulatory environment as well. And, some sort of breakup of even YouTube and Google, for example, or Maps and Google Search, I think could further erode some of the, potential competitive advantages that Google has today. Interestingly enough, I just went on an errand for the first time in several weeks this morning and heard an NPR ad from DuckDuckGo where they positioned themselves as a privacy company. Not even a search engine. That was their tagline, was this segment sponsored by DuckDuckGo, a privacy company. So I do think that they and Apple both, I think, have really they're meeting the consumer demand for privacy. They're sort of matching their positioning to what they're sensing in the world of consumers. And the ad that you highlighted a couple weeks ago, Greg, from Apple with all of the marketer tracking people following the guy to the couch or whatever.
It's very effective.
And then disappearing. I think that's a really effective ad. It's now playing during half of the NBA playoff games that I'm watching. And I think that the sort of combination of regulation, credible competitors to Google from a technology standpoint, and Google's lack of adherence or certainly prioritization of privacy they're all sort of coming together, and they could erode Google's position. I don't think, though, by any stretch that even Apple will become the dominant search engine, however.
No, I would agree with that. But I think an interesting scenario is like Apple buying Neva or somebody like that. Apple, I don't know what the guts of Apple's sort of search technology is at this point. They have some sophisticated people there, but I think they could accelerate their search with an acquisition potentially, which would be very easy for them to do. On the regulatory front, there were the 6 bills that made it, or the 5+1 bills that made it out of committee, the Judiciary Committee, and are now sort of going to the House floor for discussion. And the big tech companies have been lobbying against that. It's I don't know what we're going to see come out as law. That'll be an very interesting thing to see. But I do think that breaking these companies up is definitely on the table and contemplated by some of these activities. We're going to see something. I don't know how strong or weak it'll be.
I'm curious, do either of you use the built-in search function of Siri, where you either ask her to look something up for you, even if you look on Google, or where you can just enter, move into the search screen and enter a query?
Yes.
I mean, it's built in every place. So it's like, I assume most iPhone users use that search function, which is both app-based and phone-based and internet-based. In other words, it looks at everything. And it reduces search to just a piece of the data.
It depends on the type. It depends on the type of search for me. I think if it's a question, trivia or a specific
dinner tables, get the fact.
Exactly. Or what time is the Suns playoff game tomorrow or something like that. Then yes, I'll use Siri. But I think for a more complex search, I still default on my phone. I default to Google, and on the desktop, I sort of alternate between Google and DuckDuckGo. So.
On the phone, I frequently ask very complicated queries these days of Google via Siri, right? So it's a multi-sentence.
Hey Siri, ask Google for,
and a long sentence, which is an incredibly powerful search because I don't have to type the long sentence on my phone.
Right. I would say my search profile on mobile, which is where a lot of my search activity is happening, not 100%, is I use the search bar, the native to the iPhone. I sometimes will go to a browser, which my default search engine is Google, and I'll either go to the Google app or I'll go to Safari and type it into the bar, and then sometimes I'll use DuckDuckGo. If I'm like looking up, who was in that movie or something like that, I'll often use DuckDuckGo because I'm conscious of the ways in which Google is watching my search behavior and giving me information in my Discover feed based on my search history, and I don't want a lot of sort of frivolous information in there, So I do a variety of things depending on the circumstances.
Wow, that's complicated.
Why are you smiling, Mike?
Well, I'm just thinking, what movie did you watch that you don't want Google to know?
Well, no, but
that was the question that came to mind.
Yeah, no. It's just like random things that come up that are sort of silly or frivolous or
I understand. Makes sense. The Google app for me shows a lot of engagement rings stories because I'm always searching on engagement rings.
This guy's the most divorced man in the world.
Precisely. I mean, I really like the Google Discover feed, and I appreciate that it does personalize results to some degree to my query behavior. And I'm conscious of the way in which I would pollute that with, some portion of my searches that, I don't care. I don't care about.
It seems to be smart though. If you don't click on those, it stops delivering them. Like I've obviously been, and maybe it's not obvious. I've shifted diets to a more strict diet, and it's been very helpful seeing those things in my feed. I've started riding e-bikes. I've become interested in e-bike technology. It's very interesting to see those. It's interesting to see the recipes. Interestingly, the engagement ring thing pops up less and less because I never click on them. So it doesn't get, even though it potentially could pollute it, it does for a short time.
Yeah.
It seems like a smart enough feed where it doesn't stick around. It is, it's an interesting feed to take a look at.
Yeah.
And I use it as just part of my news
I do too.
Scouring every morning.
I do too.
So look there, I'll look at the Apple feed, I'll look at my feed reader, and that's my, sort of starting point for my day.
Yeah. And speaking of, I'm trying to find a transition into your.
There is no transition.
Mike, what was the top story in your feed this week?
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of news,
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.